Hi, class. Take a note of the screen that you see now. We're going to go start on our next lesson in the Cold War sequence, but you want to use these keys to view your lesson. You can go forward or backward when the video is playing to see the questions or unsee the questions, and just hit those keys. And also, if you want to pause the video, hit the space bar. So you can always hit the space bar and then go back or go forward to the screens. And why you do this will become apparent now when we do the next lesson. So this lesson is about Cold War 13. It's about the counterculture. There was a lot of resistance in the 60s and 70s. A lot of things were going on. A lot of anti-war, anti-Vietnam war movement. And then there was the civil rights movement at the same time in the 1960s. So there's a lot of countercultural things going on during those periods, the 1960s and 70s. In the 1960s, the United States claimed its place as the world's leading defender against communism. But by the end of the decade, the nation was convulsed by dissent, riot, assassinations, and increasingly unpopular war. The 60s was a terrible time. So many people got assassinated during that. John F. Kennedy had started off in 60. He got assassinated. And then Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy also got assassinated. And even George Wallace was shot during his presidential campaign, but he was only paralyzed. He wasn't killed. So in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, who seemed to be mainly the embodiment of a new age, he was a young guy, a new president. We go, oh, we're going to start over again. We're going to get things going. So Kennedy had attacked President Eisenhower's conduct of the Cold War and promised to defend the free world against communism. So here you have a Democrat that was criticizing a Republican President Eisenhower because he wasn't tough enough on communism. And so John F. Kennedy was a real anti-communist. He increased the U.S. military budget, and he created thousands more defense industry jobs. He also started the person that started the Vietnam War was Kennedy, wasn't Johnson. But while the U.S. economy was booming, the good life was not available to all Americans. So many southern states, laws prevented blacks and whites from traveling together, eating together, or even going to the same school. Black Americans were denied jobs and the right to vote. Civil rights activists held peaceful demonstrations, but they were often beaten and jailed by the police. J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI during those years, and he tried to help the Kennedy administration deal with this civil unrest. So here's the question. John F. Kennedy was known as the peace candidate, yet what did he do to the defense budget in contradiction to his image? He increased it. A. Number two, who was director of the FBI in the early 1960s? Well, you can see it right there. It was J. Edgar Hoover. You can see it right down here on the screen. All right, let's go to the next question. George Wallace of Alabama saw the growing civil rights movement as part of a communist conspiracy. It was a view that was shared privately by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and discrimination against blacks covered extensively on television damaged Americans' credibility as freedom's champion in the Cold War. We were going around the world telling how evil communism was and how bad it was and how it suppressed its people. And then at the same time, you had all these demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations that were being broadcast on TV. So other countries in the world said, what are you talking about? Look, you don't have freedom in your own country. In fact, other people in the government suspected that the civil rights movement might be part of some internal communist conspiracy. And on the orders of Robert Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King's hotel rooms were bugged. Postcards were circulated showing Dr. King at a supposedly communist meeting. Of course, none of this was true, but it fed into the fear of Americans had about communism abroad and at home. And if you see down here, you see Martin Luther King. I remember this postcard when it came out. It circulated all over the place, and it purported to show Dr. King at a communist meeting. I don't know if it was a communist meeting or not. But it was right in the middle of the civil rights movement as well. So there's your question. George Wallace was what? Who fought what in the early 60s? You have to figure this out on your own, okay? George Wallace was a Democrat. How did some feel that the civil rights movement hurt the United States in the war against communism? How did the civil rights movement hurt our image in the world? In other words, the Great Society. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, had a vision for the Great Society. Central to that vision was a war against poverty and the abolition of racial discrimination. Johnson was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and later that year he won an easy victory against a Republican opponent, Senator Barry Goldwater, who denounced Johnson's Great Society as creeping socialism. Johnson did not care. He got blamed with the Vietnam War, and it was unfair, because Johnson was not into the Vietnam War. All he wanted to do was end discrimination, he wanted to help poverty, and he wanted to end discrimination in the South. That was his two main goals. He wanted to be like FDR. Johnson was an old FDR Democrat, and he wanted to put in place many programs to help the poor in America. Medicare and Medicaid were two of his programs. In those days, the Southern Democrats had control of the Congress, and they usually blocked any kind of pro-civil rights laws. Johnson had been majority leader in the Senate before he became vice president under Kennedy. He knew how to control those Southern politicians and was able to get pro-civil rights laws passed through Congress. One time he grabbed one of the Southern Democrats, Dennis, who was from Mississippi, and a very powerful person in Congress, and he got him in the corner. He said, look, you're going to pass this, well, he cursed too, he cursed a lot. You're going to pass this MF bill or else I'm going to do something to you. And the guy turned around and voted for it. Johnson was a tough guy, but he was soft inside. He just wanted to help people, really, even though his exterior, he looked like a rough cowboy or something. Anyway, Johnson had a vision for America, but once he got bogged down in the Vietnam War, he was never able to fully implement his vision. He hated the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, dissent was flourishing on America's campuses. At the University of California at Berkeley, students borrowed the tactics of the civil rights movement, organizing strikes and sit-ins. And they were all anti-Johnson. I felt sorry for the guy during those years, and I actually got together a little campaign to support him and got petitions signed, and he ended up inviting me to the White House to present to positions, but I don't want to get into that. It was a tumultuous time, and I just think he was treated unfairly. So anyway, what did President Johnson call his vision for America? You have to, what he called in the reading. You can go back and find the answer in the reading. What was Lyndon Johnson's job in the Kennedy administration? What did he do for President Kennedy? Who was the Republican who ran against Lyndon Johnson in 1964? Why was it so hard to get civil rights laws passed through Congress? And I explained that in the readings. Lyndon Johnson never did get all the Great Society programs enacted. Why not? And you can look up the answer there as well. Sex and war. American ideals of political freedom were now being extended into the personal realm. The availability of new birth control, such as the pill, revolutionized many people's views of sexual behavior. Many women burned their bras and they demanded equal pay for equal work, and they rebelled against being treated as sexual objects. The National Organization for Women was started by Betty Friedan. Now, you guys probably laugh at that today, but back in the 1960s, if we were in a teacher's meeting and there was one woman in the meeting, you'd say, will you go get coffee for us, will you? And the woman would get up and go get coffee for the whole meeting. Women were just treated that way. They just expected them to do that. Honey, go get me a beer, will you? That's the way that women were treated in those days. And so many women rebelled. They said, we got to be treated more equally. The National Organization of Women started. And a lot of women, actually, Atlantic City, in front of the Miss America contest, they got a big barrel and set it on fire, and all these women were on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, taking off their bras and throwing them into the fire just to show as a protest. In 1965, Johnson began sending U.S. ground troops to Vietnam. He said, we got to get this Vietnam War behind us so we can get onto the Great Society. Despite the extension of the military draft, Johnson's efforts in Vietnam enjoyed popular support. In the early 60s, people could easily see the connection between the war in Vietnam and the larger Cold War. People believed in the domino theory. The domino theory said that if Vietnam falls, then the country next to it, Laos and Cambodia, will fall, and then Thailand will fall, and then one country after the other will fall over like dominoes. So we've got to stop the first country from going communist, and that was Vietnam. And the domino theory said if you let Vietnam go communist, all the other countries in the area will eventually turn communist. In the early 60s, the United States was on the verge of tremendous social, political, and ethical changes that would come later in the decade. Few people saw this whole change coming. So, question 10, President Johnson was very what in the early 60s? Question 11, what did the women's movement indicate about the 1960s? 12, who started the National Organization for Women, NOW, now? And that's answers over on the assignment over here. Okay, let's go to the next screen. The counterculture. While some Americans went off to the war in Vietnam, others were challenging with that what was termed the establishment. They used to say the establishment. That meant the government. The establishment was all forms of authority. They rejected materialism, not for communism, but instead for love, peace, drugs, and rock and roll. All over the United States, young people of draft age were turning in, and dropping out. They used to say, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Turn on means turn on to drugs, tune into the message of the movement, and drop out of the society. These counterculture young people were called hippies by some people. A vast majority of Americans spurned the new counterculture, but protests against the war were growing. With marches and draft card burnings, meanwhile, Americans were in Vietnam bogged on. By 1967, 500,000 U.S. soldiers were there. And a lot of you could get out of the draft. They had a draft then where they would draft people and put them in the service whether you wanted to or not. Well, one way to avoid the draft and not be drafted to go to Vietnam was to be enrolled in college. If you were enrolled in college, you didn't get drafted. So a lot of these kids just got enrolled in college, and some of them didn't even take classes. They were just enrolled, and that way they got out of the draft. And then they also had these demonstrations where they burned their draft cards, and some of them that did get drafted ran away and went to Canada. There was a large group of Americans living in Canada for a long time. So, 13, what was the counterculture for? The counterculture was a symptom of what? And you can answer that question by reading the reading. What statement is true? By 1967, how many soldiers were fighting in Vietnam? Those are all easy questions, and you can get the answers right from here. All right, let's jump on to the end now. Discontent. In America's inner city, some black activists trained as paramilitaries in what they saw as a civil war against racist police force. Led by a guy named Huey Newton, they called themselves the Black Panthers. The Panthers murdered a school superintendent in Oakland. By the summer of 1967, discontent boiled over, and riots in several major cities broke out. By March 1968, with a growing war in Vietnam and a conflict at home, Johnson declared that he would not run for a second term as president. But that's not why he didn't run. Real reason he didn't run was that the Kennedys, when Johnson was vice president under the Kennedys, they treated him pretty badly. They used to make fun of him. They'd say, "What college did you go to, Lyndon?" And they always made fun of him because he went to a little teachers' college in Texas, West Texas State Teachers College, where the Kennedys and all them went to Harvard and Yale and all these Ivy League schools. So they used to make fun of and put down President Kennedy. Kennedy did not like Bobby Kennedy. They were mortal enemies. And so even though we were both Democrats, and even though Johnson was vice president in the Kennedy administration, but I don't want to go and give a personal part of this. I know personally this is true because I was there when people were talking about it. Anyway, Bobby Kennedy decided he was going to run for president against Lyndon Johnson for president. And Lyndon Johnson said, he's probably going to win if he runs against me because he's more glamorous, he knows how to talk. And so Johnson could not stand the thought of being beaten for presidency by Bobby Kennedy. So I remember the night it happened. I was getting ready for work, and he came on TV. President Johnson said, "I'm not going to run for president in the next 1968. So he bailed out and didn't run for president again. Now, in 1968, also saw the killings of two prominent Americans. Civil rights leader activist Martin Luther King was shot dead by a white gunman. Several weeks later, Bobby Kennedy, brother of the late president and himself a presidential candidate, was killed while campaigning in California. To many, it looked like the United States was on the verge of revolution and falling apart. There you see Huey Newton speaking to the communist Chinese. That didn't endear very well with Americans. So, here are the questions. 17, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party? What were the Black Panthers? President Johnson decided not to run for a second term because Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. That was really one of the reasons. That's true. After the assassination of Dr. King, there were major riots in the American cities. Is that true? Finally, the crackdown. In August 1968, that was a tumult, probably one of the worst years in American history. In August 1968, Democratic Party delegates arrived in Chicago to pick their candidate for the November presidential election. So the Democrats met in Chicago. They're going to pick who they want to run in the next election. Along with the delegates came about 100,000 anti-war demonstrators. The protesters gathered in the city parks in preparation for a march at the convention hall. But Chicago Mayor Democrat Richard Daley had no intention of allowing them to take over the convention. He didn't like them. He was a Democrat, but he did not like the revolutionaries within the party. On the day the Democrats were due to nominate their presidential candidate, the demonstrators battled with police. It was a riot outside the Democratic convention. You see pictures of it there on the screen. The situation inside the convention hall was also combative. Supporters of anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy were prevented from debating the war. Vice President Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic presidential candidate. Hubert Humphrey was a real strong liberal, but Hubert Humphrey was more moderate compared to, say, McCarthy and some of the other people in the party. And so he had the inside track, and he had the support of President Johnson as well to become the presidential candidate. So Hubert Humphrey was the liberal, but he was on the more moderate side of the Democrat Party. So, with a promise to crack down on lawlessness, his Republican opponent Richard Nixon won the November elections by less than 1%. The Cold War and the war in Vietnam would continue. So, during that election, they elected Richard Nixon. Actually, won the general election, Republican, in 1968, and he became president instead of Hubert Humphrey. So it was a difficult time, a very tumultuous time, and anyway, very sad time. I'm pausing because it was such a sad time for me. So these are the final questions. At what convention did the Chicago riots take place? Who was nominated by the Democrats to run in '68? Who was nominated by the Republicans to run for president in '68? Who won the election and elected president in the U.S. in '68? Why didn't Lyndon Johnson run for the second term? And then you answer that question as well. We've talked about that. So, guys, those are all the questions for this session. Hope you're learning something about the Cold War and about the interaction of the Americans with the Cold War and how the effect that it had on the United States and the world. I want to thank you for your attention. You're a great class, and I appreciate your